Good evening, everybody. So glad you could join us. I am Aaron Glass, Professor of Cultural Anthropology and Associate Chair of Research Programs here at Bard Graduate Center. On behalf of our director, Susan Weber, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this year's installment of our annual series, Indigenous Arts in Transition, which I program with my faculty colleague, Ivan Gaskell, who is here with me. Here at BGC, we study cultural histories through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past in the present. We do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space, in the heart of Lenapehoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape people, and a past, present, and future home for Indigenous peoples from around the world. We are also one block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners that was forcibly relocated to create Central Park. Our talk tonight will directly address the power of Indigenous objects, textiles in particular, to draw connections across generations through a combination of museum collection study, oral history, embodied knowledge, and creative practice. I'm honored to welcome and to introduce Hector Manuel Meneses Lozano, the current director and the former conservator and collections manager of the Textile Museum of Oaxaca, where he has worked since 2008. Before that, he was the coordinator of special projects at the city's Museo Belbera Jimenez, a private collection of Mexican jewelry from pre-Columbian times to the present. A graduate of the National School of Conservation, Restoration, and Museum Studies in Mexico City, Meneses brings his experience and expertise as a trained conservator to his curatorial, museological, and scholarly engagement with textiles, especially those from Mexico and Mesoamerica more broadly. He threads these perspectives together in wide-ranging collaborative projects that bring academics, museum professionals, and indigenous weavers into mutual dialogue and exploration, and that result in diverse media formats and products. One such project from a decade ago focused on the science, art, and dexterity of textile restoration. A more recent one has examined comparative feather textiles from across the Americas. Meneses is also the founder of an experimental weaving and embroidery workshop in Oaxaca, the coordinator of an intercultural certificate program in loom weaving, about which some of us heard yesterday at lunch, and the co-founder of the biennial Mesoamerican Textile Encounter, a forum for exchange between different professions that consists of special exhibitions, workshops, lectures, demonstrations, expo sales, and cultural tours. He has published extensively in Spanish and English on various technical and cultural aspects of textile conservation, and has curated a number of exhibitions, most at the Textile Museum of Oaxaca, including To Reinvent Oneself in 2021, What's in a Name in 2023, and Embracing Mutability, Adaptation and Permanence in Japanese Textiles from this year. Tonight, Meneses will be speaking about a recent collaborative project to explore the history and contemporary production of customary tunics in Mexico. The title of his talk is Huipiles for a 500-year-old woman. Please join me in welcoming Hector Manuel Meneses Lozano.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Aaron, Ivan, Andrew, the whole team for inviting me here tonight and the whole week. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm even happier because I get to talk about one of my favorite projects of all times, which is this exhibition that we presented last year. So we are going to be talking about huipiles, which is a plural of huipil, a female garment that Mesoamerican women are still wearing today. We are going to be talking about the weavers that create those huipiles. And we are going to talk about a 500-year-old woman. And I will start with her story. And in order to do that, I would like to go back to this project that was called Noti Conquista. It was put together by a group of people from different backgrounds, including historians, anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, writers, poets, and it ran from 2019 to 2021. And if you get a chance to go onto their website. I suggest you do. It's a very fascinating project. They talk about articles, timelines, historical figures, biographies of those historical figures. And why 2019 to 2021? Because exactly 500 years before, 1529 to 1521, were the Mesoamerican Wars, where the Spanish and hundreds and thousands of indigenous allies were able to overthrow the Mexica city, the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. One of these historical figures is here. It's called Marina. And who was she? We don't know much about her actually. But there are many texts, novels, some pure fantasy, and some more grounded. Among those, Camilla Townsend has a gorgeous book about her life. And for the purposes of this talk today, I decided to hear from herself who she was. How can we do that? Via Twitter. As part of this Noticonquista project in 2019, there was a group of women from indigenous communities that decided to give voice to this woman. And in April 2019, they started tweeting. And you will see that this is not Spanish. We didn't know what it was until shortly after that same day, Fe Navarrete, who is one of the main coordinators of that Noticonquista project, tells us that this is the first tweet of Marina in 2019, and it's in Oluteco language. So Oluteco was probably, most likely, the language that Marina learned to speak when she was born. But she didn't only spoke Oluteco. To the right, you see that she's introducing herself. She's saying, "My name is Malintzin," in Oluteco, Nahuatl, Chontal from Tabasco, Maya, and Spanish. These were the languages that Marina spoke. And these were the languages that put her in such a privileged spot in history. So I've been talking about Marina, but you see that her username is Malintzin. So what's with that? And she tells us, she clarifies that story for us. We don't know what her original name was, but when the Spanish baptized her, they called her Marina. When that was adopted in Nahuatl, because there is no R sound in Nahuatl, it was changed into Malina. And as time went by and more people got to talk to her and got to meet her and got to establish a conversation with her, she became a respected woman, a very respected woman. And that's why a suffix was added into his name, Tsin, which means a form of respect, a form of reverence. And that's how Malina turned to Malintzin. If you go to Mexico today and ask about Malintzin on the streets, people are going to look at you like, who? Who's that? Because she's not known as Malintzin, she's known as Malinche. Malinche is a Spanish deformation of Malintzin, which is kind of interesting because there was a Spanish name, Marina, then it went to Nahuatl into Malintzin, and then it went back to Spanish as Malinche. As centuries went by, though, Malinche became a derogatory name. And if you are in Mexico today and people call you a malinchista, you, ¿qué malinchista eres? How malinchista are you? It means that you prefer everything that comes from abroad over your own culture. And that is not what Malintzin did. And that was not her life. And she's putting it here. I am not Malinche. I am Malintzin. She continues explaining who she was, and she tells us that far from all those fantasy stories where people and historians and intellectuals of Mexico in the 20th century call her a traitor of Mexico and a romantic partner of Hernan Cortés, she says it had nothing to do with romance to begin with. And I was not a traitor because Mexico as a country didn't exist. And I was not a traitor to the Mexica people either because I didn't belong to that nation. And they actually oppressed the people I was born into. She continues to tell those stories, but then in November that year, she says, I wore huipiles all my life. I never adopted the Spanish attire. And that is what sparked the whole project I'm going to be talking about. Because Jasnaya Elena Aguilar Gil, she's a Yuk linguist and a very dear friend. She was one of the women that gave voice to Malintzin for this project. And Jasnaya asked me one day, we were talking, and she said, what were her huipiles like? What did they look like? What they were made of? How big were they? What techniques were? What materials, etc. And we cannot we cannot know for sure because nothing has survived from that period, at least that we know of. But we do have a good idea about what her huipiles look like. And we can start by looking at this codex. This is the oldest representation that we know of, the earliest representation that we know of Malintzin, although it was painted a year after she passed away. And this is her. She appears here, and we see that her huipil, a very large huipil, is also worn by many other women in the depiction here. So we can tell that it wasn't a special huipil. It responded to a style that was used in the central area of Mexico in the 16th century. If we look at it closer, we can see that it is very wide, it is very long, it has decoration around the neck opening, it has a small rectangle under the neck opening, it has some decorations on the bottom border, and the whole fabric looks with a certain kind of texture that we cannot tell for sure what it was. Then, if we look at the other women who are there with her, we see some other variations, some spot motifs, some rows of motifs, some checkered patterns. We even see some translucent fabrics. And this was probably, most likely, due to the fineness of the yarn plus a very light and open weave. When we look at the images on the right, those are two other documents from the 16th century, and we can see that the huipil is still responding to those same characteristics. And the image in the middle has these sort of three-dimensional elements, maybe feathers, and we will be talking about that in a few minutes. It is important to mention that every time that Malintzin is represented, she is wearing these sorts of huipiles, but in this codex in particular, this is the lienzo de Tlaxcala. This is the Tlaxcalan version of what happened when the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica. She is right at the center because she is the one that's speaking. Hernan Cortés couldn't communicate with the other people, and Malintzin, because of her knowledge in all those languages that we mentioned before, was able to interpret for him. When we look at some other documents from the 16th century as well, we start to see some more characteristics, some more information about them. In this, we can see kind of the same traits that we've seen so far, the length and the width of the huipil, the overall composition of where the ornamentation is located and placed. But then this gives us another important bit of information. These are three lengths of fabric joined together, and the midsection is the one that is striped. And this makes sense because they must have been woven on a backstrap loom, and there's a maximum width that you can weave on that loom. It also kind of suggests that the mid fabric, the central panel is a little bit wider than the two lateral ones. But then again, we can never know for sure when we're looking at these images because we don't know how faithful they are in representing reality or if they are replicating a prototype of certain sort. Time goes by and we get to the end of the 17th century. We see a bride in red, joined by her mother in blue to her left. And we see the same style, but now we see an additional piece of information, which is all those white little dots that seem kind of three-dimensional. They seem kind of, they seem to be a different texture than the rest of the huipil. This is from a folding screen that is housed at LACMA. And again, we cannot know for sure if this was something that the painter imagined or if he or I would like to think of as she sometimes um, was depicting something that they were actually looking at. But then when we look at the other figures in the screen, we can definitely tell different kinds of fabrics. We see some that are more rigid. We see some others that are more drapey. We see some others that are rough in texture, in appearance. So I think we can positively say that those white dots are actually implying a different texture. And then this image also gives us another piece of information about these huipiles, and that is the square on the back of the huipil. We had only seen the square or the rectangle on the front over the chest, but now we see the same thing happening in the back. And why can I be so sure about the textures of these elements? Because there is one huipil that has survived from it is contemporary to the screen, and it is housed at the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City. We can see the equivalence of what we're looking at in the images with the actual huipil, and then we can see the materials and the techniques that were used. The ground fabric is white cotton and brown cotton, kojuchi cotton. It's not dyed, it's the natural color of the fiber. And then all the decorations are woven using silk, digom silk, using wool, and using feather yarns. We also see that the central panel is in fact wider than the two lateral ones. We also see the three panels that conform the huipil, and those are the elements, the feathers that I was suggesting at the beginning, and that then we find here, and not only here, but also in many chronicles from the 16th century. The Spanish describe huipiles of women, the elite women, of course, having feathers into their weavings. In Oaxaca, the Museo Textil de Oaxaca, we have this fragment. I was very lucky to have had the opportunity to study it to get my degree. And when we compare it, well, these are the feather yarns. All those textured elements are made with a two-ply cotton yarn, and down feather is inserted in the middle. Down feathers were used in white, but also dyed in different colors. And this is the texture that we are likely looking at here. When we compare the fragment that we have in Oaxaca to the original huipil in Mexico City, the size, the materials, the technical sequence are completely the same. And when they were dated, we saw that they are contemporary to each other. So these are in fact responding to a style that was present at least by the end of the 17th century. And most likely, Malintzin, because of the images that we've seen, could have worn something like this Obviously, no wool and no silk, but more feather yarns and maybe rabbit hair, which was the other elite material that was used. And again, this image is just to remember that what we saw or um, suggested with this image of the center panel being wider was actually true. So, all of this, I talked to Jasnaya. And our question then wasn't what her Huipiles looked like, but if she were alive today, what would she be wearing? Such an important and respected woman. So we thought, well, maybe that is not something that you or I could answer. Maybe we should ask the weavers. And that's what we did. We invited some weavers and embroiderers from different places in Oaxaca and Guerrero and Chiapas, and we had a meeting by the end of 2022. Some of us were there on site, some of us were there via Zoom, and it was the beginning of the meeting was beautiful because just as Malinsin spoke different languages, when it was the time of introducing ourselves, 11 languages came to the room. And Fe Navarrete was there joining us from England. and Fe was explaining to the group all that happened with the Mesoamerican Wars, not calling it as the conquest of Mexico, but actually Mesoamerican Wars of indigenous peoples plus the Spanish overthrowing the Mexica people. And then Jasnaya spoke about Malintzin as an indigenous woman. And that's when she told us about romance having nothing to do with the story. It was a strategy, it was a matter of survival for Malintzin. It was the way that she had to prove herself indispensable, needed, and to guarantee her life in that way. We cannot know for sure, but it is very believable. And then Alejandro de Avila, curator, co-founder of our museum, and I spoke about the Huipiles, the materials, dimensions, techniques, and we actually had the opportunity to look at the fragment that we have in Oaxaca, as you can see on the image to the right. After all that was done, it was a very long meeting. It was about 4 hours talking to each other and asking questions. And by the end of the meeting, we asked a question to everyone present. Now that you know that Malintzin was such an important person, that she was so respected and so looked up at, imagine she goes on to your hometowns. What would you give her? What huipil would you weave for her? A year later, we presented those huipiles at the Textile Museum. These are all most of the participants. And before we got here, all the process was documented first on WhatsApp. We had numerous chat groups with every participant. It was not an individual participant, it must be said. We invited individuals to the meeting, but when they went back to their homes, they invited their families, their cooperative members, their neighbors, friends. They invited whoever they wanted to be a part of this project. And then we also started playing with the names of each chat group. Malintzin arrives in Chicahuaxtla. Malintzin in San Bartolome. Malintzin goes to San Pedro. Malintzin visits Xochislahuaca. That was part of this Noticonquista style of working. And when all of them were done, the weavers that could go to the museum did. We had some interviews with them. Everything was recorded. But then there were some others that couldn't travel for this occasion. So we had Zoom meetings with them, looking closely at the pictures of the huipiles because they were already at the museum before these interviews took place. And there was one interview that was done via WhatsApp as well, because the signal was so terrible. There was no phone signal, that only audio messages in real time going back and forth were working. And that's what we did. So these are the full Huipiles. And there are so many stories about them that it's impossible to summarize that in the few minutes I got left. But I will tell you specific ideas of each one of them. We will start with the huipil that was woven by Silvia de la Cruz Marcial. She executed the weaving and conceived most of the huipil, although there were 5 or 6 other members of this cooperative, Tejedoras Flores de la Llanura, from Xochislahuaca in Guerrero, um, working with her and just having a conversation with her as she went on. It's all cotton, industrially spun cotton, the white, and then all the color cotton is locally grown cotton, hand spun by her, by Silvia. So she spun the cotton and then wove the whole huipil. And in this one, I want to point out all that similarities that we are used to when we talk about textiles and texts and how they share information and etymologically speaking. But we are looking at that crystal clear here. Sylvia was explaining to me that this first row of elements are an abstract representation of an insect that grows in the water, that lives in the water. But these are the first elements that any weaver learns to weave. So these are the basics. Once they master this, they move on to the second row, which are also kind of an abstract representation of a firefly. Once they master those, they move on to the third row, because the third row incorporates elements of the previous 2 rows. So, you know, that those notebooks we use to learn how to write, and we contour the letter and then we repeat until it comes out naturally. Well, they are doing that with threads on a loom with no support. They are creating the support at the same time as they are weaving. So it's really wonderful. And sorry, Sylvia decided to include all these designs because she wanted Malintzin to be the recipient of all the textile history of Xochislahuaca. This huipil included motifs that weren't woven anymore, that Sylvia knew they existed because she had kept scraps of old huipiles with her, and because they were so damaged and they couldn't be used anymore, she inserted those motifs in this huipil. And she said, well, if Malintzin is going to be wearing it, I know she appreciates this, and she has now our history and our identity. This is another huipil. This was woven by Francisca Palafox and her 2 daughters, Jasmine and Lily. They are from San Mateo del Mar, an Icots town in the southeast of Oaxaca. They used indigo dyed cotton, coyuchi hand-spun cotton by Francisca, and hand-spun local silk dyed in cochineal. For the mid-section, for the central panel, Lily was explaining to me how she suggested her mom, Francisca, to represent Malintzin arriving in San Mateo by sea. She was arriving on a boat because San Mateo is surrounded by water. Then it was up to Francisca to decide how Malintzin would be represented. And Francisca decided to put on her the skirt that the Icots women wear even today, which is a very ample skirt with a very light fabric, and it's so windy that it flows like this. And her hair is also flowing, and this was desired by Francisca. Lily would explain to me that women in San Mateo never wear their hair loose. They always either braid it or put it in a bun. And Francisca, however, was thinking, what would it feel like to be on a boat and feeling the breeze flowing through one's hair? And that's the image that she chose to represent Malintzin. The sailor, Francisca said, is saying hello to the people at the shore. So we are looking at movements, we are looking at narratives, we are looking at desires, and we are looking at reality as well, because all those animals are animals that are present in San Mateo. And there's another section, you cannot see it well here, but there's another section with seahorses up on the sand, because there is a time period in the year where they do that. So she represented that time period where the seahorses are on the sand. We have another huipil woven by a mother and her two daughters, Candelaria and her daughters Ana Luisa and Guadalupe. And they chose, the museum provided all the materials for these huipiles unless they had something that they wanted to use. And Candelaria and Ana Luisa chose industrially made yarns dyed with synthetic dyes, but then for the ground fabric, and then all the elements were woven with digom silk that we had brought from China, but then had dyed locally with local dyes, cochineal, indigo, marigold, among others. It was very interesting that that they said something that made reference to this certificate course that Aaron was mentioning before. In that certificate course that we had only this year, weavers always said how textiles are not an object per se. They are kind of a subject object. And before that took place, the year before, Candelaria and Ana Luisa were explaining to me how these silk yarns were very tricky to work with. And they said it was like they were telling us, treat me carefully, otherwise I will fall down of this loom. And then they said, Candelaria said, creating this with Bill was like giving birth. Ana Luisa complemented that with a joke saying, yeah, a birth to a very spoiled child, because these silk yarns were so delicate to work with. Francisca Diaz Ortega, from the Ayuk nation of San Juan Cotzucon, decided to weave this huipil, and she incorporated also the coyuchi cotton, the silk from the mountains of Oaxaca, industrially made yarns. She would explain that she incorporated traditional motifs plus new ones, and when she talked about the new ones, she mentioned specifically this little house here. It was difficult to talk to her during the interview because I don't speak Ayuk, and her Spanish isn't that rich. But when she spoke to Jasnaja in Ayuk, because Jasnaja speaks that language, then I understood the meaning of this house. Francisca approached the museum in 2008, in 2013 or 14. And since then, she has been learning things. She has been participating in workshops. She has attended talks. She has looked at our archives. She has purchased yarns, good quality yarns that we offer at the museum. And by doing all of that, she has woven very different huipiles that she has been able to sell more and more and more. And the reason for this house is because those sales that have been made possible because of all this history with the museum have allowed her to build her house. This is a huipil that the interview was made via WhatsApp with the audio messages. This was a team effort. Rosa Rosas, Dominga Gonzalez, Rosa Martinez, Yatali Rosas, and Otilia Sandoval. All of them had something to do with this huipil. This is from the tricky town of San Andres Chicahuaxtla in Oaxaca. All that you see is natural dyes. There is no coyuchi cotton, and they decided to use cotton, but also wool, silk, and for the back of the huipil, silk ribbons also dyed with natural dyes. For this huipil, for all of the huipiles, Jasnaya had a question that she wanted to know. What do weavers consider elegant? What is an elegant huipil for them? Otilia said, well, we all weave our own huipil for special occasions. For those special occasions, our huipil must be brand new. And because we are weaving with that special occasion in mind, all of them are elegant. Otherwise, there's no way we are wearing them. So that makes me think how many times we pass on judgment based on our beauty standards without knowing the cultural and social aspects of these weavings. Alicia Molina wove this huipil and Silvia Vera embroidered it. They are from the Zapotec town of Jalalac in the northern mountains of Oaxaca. It's all industrially spun cotton and industrially spun cotton for the embroidery as well. The braid, however, is dyed with natural dyes because that is the same dye that they use for the wraparound skirt. They didn't include the wraparound skirt, but the dye and the thin brown stripes on the central area of the huipil are making reference to that wraparound skirt. The huipil in Jalalac is a two-panel huipil. We have seen that the huipiles when Malintzin was alive were most commonly from 3 panels. They decided to keep the 2 panels, but simulated the 3 by incorporating those stripes, which was very clever. And then for the embroidery, they included so many elements that convey so much information. Top right, there is a woman in the kitchen and she's working with corn in different preparations, even beverages that include corn and the seed of cacao. Corn being so important, it is also present in the midsection. The corn is present there. And then they don't only base their food on corn. Oh, sorry. Beans are there. This is the flower of the bean plant. And squash, that is also there. The crops are so important that they incorporated this stone figure that sits at Alicia's house, and Don Federico, Alicia's husband, takes it out to the field to ask for a good harvest. They wanted Malintzin to have the best harvest of Jalalac. They wanted to give her the best food that was produced in Jalalac. They also included these elements that represent dances of Oaxaca, dances that define certain ceremonies and certain neighborhoods in Oaxaca. And why did they do all of this? Silvia would explain. Malintzin's story was deformed over time and it was forgotten. Part of it was forgotten. We don't want that to happen to our history. So this is a codex of Jalalac today, woven on a huipil, meant for Malintzin. Melina Martinez, Ildefonso, Adrián Ildefonso, and Boris Garcia, who is Melina's son, worked with this huipil. They come from the Mazatec town of Huautla Jimenez in Oaxaca. And they are embroiderers. So all the decoration here, except for the blue stripes on the ground fabric, are embroidered. They use the feather yarns. They also use rabbit hair. The pink texture on the right, top right, is rabbit hair. And they decided to represent over the chest the two-headed bird, a two-headed bird. We usually find a two-headed eagle, but they decided to not use a double-headed eagle. They decided to include 2 different birds. To the right, we see an eagle. Huautla, the name of it is linked to eagles in Nahuatl. It was known as a place of eagles. And to the left, another important animal, the guajolote, the turkey, which is always present in ceremonies and rituals. They decided to also incorporate feathers right in the center and in the four corners, feathers of guacamaya, because guacamayas are the birds that are the messengers between the human world and the spiritual world. And finally, red, because when they think about red in Mazatec language, it also means good things, and they wish nothing but good things for Malintzin. And finally, Odilon Merino and his aunt Ofelia Regina Victoria from San Pedro Musgos, also in Oaxaca, created this huipil, and they used nothing but the best materials. Hand spun cotton everywhere, both white and coyuchi, then white dyed with indigo, white dyed with the shellfish, purple, and hand spun silk dyed with cochineal. All the cotton was spun by Ofelia, Doña Ofelia, and then Odilon put this together. He would tell me, this is so special because of the materials that are in it, the time we spent producing those materials, and it is so special that no other woman but Malintzin would be able to wear it. So this mention of Malintzin being a deserver of these huipiles and this affection was present in all of the interviews. I only told you a little bit of those stories, but it was present everywhere. It was so vivid, the presence of Malintzin, that some of them, when I asked them, what would you tell her now that she's in front of you and you're giving this huipil to her, what would you tell them? What would you tell her? Some of them were like, I would tell her, always spoken in present tense. Hello, Malintzin, how are you? Thank you for coming to my house. I prepared a special huipil for you. I know you will like it. I know you appreciate this. This is for you. This is common dialogue, common conversation in these places. It's only a matter of respect. Now, all these huipiles are part of the Textile Museum's collection. The foundation that sponsors us gave a monetary award to every family, a, a sum that very well covered the production of the huipil plus an extra. And if you want to know more, because I know I ran through the information, we have these two publications. To the left, a narrative of how the project came to be. It was published at a newsletter of our foundation. And to the right, a micro website on the museum's website that is solely dedicated to this project. It's all in Spanish, but then again, you can copy and paste onto any online translator today. So thank you very much. And now you see why this is so close to my heart and why I'm so happy to be able to talk about this today. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. If anyone has a question for Hector, please raise your hand.
There's one back there.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Hector, and welcome.
Thank
Good
you.
to see you again.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
I'm very curious. I know that metal has been used in pre-Columbian times, and I don't think I have come across at this moment to repeal them may have had metal also has been part of the design.
Yeah, we haven't found any association of metal objects on Huipiles. They are in some feather attires, like the penacho, the famous penacho. It had gold medallions on top of it. There was even a golden beak in front of it. But in Huipiles, we haven't found that. And maybe it's because of the use these huipiles have, because they are meant to be used, and well, except for the very special ones that like this, Malintzin would have probably kept them and be buried with them. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks. Thank you so much for this. It's fascinating. I want to know if the weavers all had pre-existing relationships with the museum, or if not, how did you find them? How did you assemble the group?
Yes, we had already established bonds with each one of them. Some of them go back to before the museum was even open to the public, and some of them, I think, it was a family of the Silvia, the embroiderer of Jalala with the codex. She, we had just met her earlier that year. She was the newest, but the others, Francisca was since 2014, 13 that I said, and the people from San Andres Chicahuaxtla, the Otilia and her family, they have been present since 2008, the year that the museum opened. And we have actually made some other projects with some of them. For some of them, this wasn't the first time that they were working with one of our experimental ideas.
Hector, Hector, thank you so much. It was really fabulous. I have a question. I hope I followed everything correctly. Melanzin, as she's represented, we have only in colonial representations, correct?
Yeah.
And so I wonder how this figures into what we will call local or indigenous conceptualizations of weaving.
Mhm.
And the second question is, of course, question about archaeology. To what extent we actually can find underground buried burials with indigenous weaving of indigenous period that is not necessarily colonial, that might help us shape a different image of Melanzin than is represented in the colonial painting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That is a very interesting question, and I'm glad you made it because I couldn't include it in my time. um, it is interesting to notice how the view, and mostly male from the 20th century, portray Malintzin as this traitor, while within indigenous communities, amidst indigenous communities, she is always been a respected person. There are different dances where Malintzin is portrayed, and there are in some of those dances, girls, the moment they are born, their families sign them up to be Malintzin when they become 16, 18, 22 years old. That's how important it is. And there is a town close to Oaxaca, Teotitlán del Valle, where they have this dance of Malinche. And the person that portrays Malinche has that title for the rest of her life. So whenever she gets into any kind of celebration, the moment she arrives, the band has to stop and play the music that is meant to be for Malintzin. That's how important she is. So that's what Jasnaya was telling us in that meeting. If you get a chance to invite Jasnaya sometime, please do. She is amazing. And that's what she was explaining to us, how different these perspectives were, and how even if there were only a few people naming her a traitor, they were so important that that's the view that came to be the official story, while the stories in all of these communities that inspire respect are not heard of, are not known of. The second question, we don't have that many textiles. The environmental conditions in Mexico are not the best to preserve these materials, especially in the central area. There are some others in the north, from the north area, and some that have been found in caves. Laura Filloy, that you all know, she has published a very good paper on kind of almost an inventory of the archaeological textiles that have been found in Mexico, which aren't that many. aren't that big either. It's only small fragments most of the times, and very rarely we see a little bit of color on them. We would love to have the luck of the southern archaeological textiles that seem so new, brand new.
Any other questions?
Here.
Thank you so much for
you.
this presentation. I'm wondering if there were like any precedents for an exhibition of this kind that involved um, material production with indigenous communities, and any exhibitions in the future that kind of combine this object research and historical dress information with current, like contemporary production.
I think overall, no, but there have been some other exhibitions that incorporate one of those elements. We have done that in the past. For example, in 2018, when the museum it was celebrating its 10th anniversary, we invited weavers from different places in Oaxaca to work together and co-create something new to celebrate those years, because again, all of them have been close to the museum during those years. Then 2016 we had an exhibition on feather work inspired by the research on the feather yarns. So we reproduced those yarns. They were no longer made. This was after the research was done and the museum opened in 2008. Our first workshop aimed at weavers was this technique. We wanted them to know what we found and what we thought was made in order to obtain those yarns. Some of them took the task to heart and they continued doing that. And there is one person in Totitlan, Roman Gutierrez, that has really perfected the technique. And we use those yarns created by him and dyed by him to give to weavers, but also contemporary textile artists. And that was a very interesting exhibition. It's also on our website. It also has its microsite.
Aaron has a question.
Thanks so much, Hector. This is such a great project for so many reasons.
Yeah,
One of the things that I kept thinking about and I really love about it is that, you know, in the kind of history of promoting and managing indigenous arts, often with good intentions, there's often an imposition by anthropologists, archaeologists, traders, whoever, in suggesting to indigenous makers that they make things in the old way, you know, that they go back to the real things from the past. And I just love about this project that the kind of historical consciousness that emerges from it was totally different than that. And what I'm really interested in is to hear about the dynamic of the workshop before they formulated their ideas of what they would produce for Valentin, and in particular, collectively looking at the codices, looking at the example in your museum, the kinds of things that we in academia think of as research. You know what I mean? And could you give us a sense across the weavers who seem to have had different kinds of relationships with the museum and with these kinds of projects, whether for some of those techniques, let's call them, were new? Were some of them very familiar with and already practicing a kind of research to supplement, whether it's collections based, library based, whatever, to supplement the practices they had learned and developed through other means? I'm interested in that sort of range of methodologies, say, and whether this project introduced any to people, or whether they were already engaged in some of those in their own practices. Thanks.
So the day that we met and talked about this project, I think everyone was so excited that we became all muted. There were no questions, there were no ideas, no proposal. There were just like, okay, we received all this information. Now we need to process it. And that's why the chat groups on WhatsApp were so useful, because that was the moment when we all were ready to talk about things and to ask questions and to, for us on the museum side, to share additional information that could be useful for them. The one thing that they take into account was the format and dimensions. And that is very interesting because that is the way they work. Whenever they receive a commission, that is the first thing they need to know. How big is it going to be? And then the rest is up to them. It's always up to them. In this case, sometimes there are some people that ask you, what do you want me to weave? But in this case, none of them asked that. That wasn't even a question. It wasn't like, I am deciding what I'm going to do with this. And they all use their own resources and their own techniques, their own visions of huipil making. Maybe some of the designs are not meant for a huipil, like the one from Chiapas, the third left to right on the top. Those motifs go onto a um, head cover for men. All of those motifs go onto that garment, and they decided to use them because that represents a very important ceremony, the biggest ceremony, the biggest patron of the town, is when those head covers are used. So Malintzin, being so important, deserve nothing but that. And then the one next to it, Francisca, she decided to stick to the measurements, like perfectly. And you can tell from all of this, that is the one that resembles the most to the old one. And that is because she really wanted to portray that. And she would tell me how difficult it was for her to actually manage to match all the three bands on the lower section of the huipil because they are woven separately. So it was a real challenge for her. So I don't think they ask what we were saying yesterday. I don't think they needed to learn anything more from us other than what we told them. And we are learning still today a lot from these 8 huipiles. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question about the livelihood. How do most of these people actually do they make a living from weaving? I noticed that some were cooperatives, and are those supported by the local government or the state in any way? And is it mainly commissions, or do they also produce for markets? What are the economics of their livelihoods?
Yeah, thank you. All of them, all of the people that participated in this live from women. So this is their job. This is 100% their job, plus um, a passion, because they cannot split that. They cannot say this is my job and this is my passion. It is kind of intertwined, closely knitted together. And some of them work as a family. For example, the blue one, they always work as a family. However, they have within the family Francisca, who is the mother. She works with certain weavers and create some huipiles and sell them. And one of her daughters, Jasmine, works with other women and they have a different cooperative. So when they were creating this, they would explain to me during the interview that this was something unique that they don't know if it's going to be repeated again because they never work together. Each one of them creates their own things. And this was the first time that they sat down and decided what to weave and actually weave together because the lateral sections were woven one by Jasmine, one by Lily, and the central by Francisca. And yet the lower sections match because they were counting the threads and measuring the strength they were using when weaving so that they would match in the end. The cooperative in Guerrero, the one in the top, the first one, They also live of weaving, but they also work in the fields, and they also teach. And even if it's not always counted, they have a family, and that is a big job that takes up a lot of their time. So many times they are weaving late at night or in the little in-betweens, in between tasks. uh, Another reason why it cannot be separated as a job versus a living and existing in this planet. And they are not supported by the government. I don't think there is any cooperative or family workshop in Mexico that is supported by the government. They all work on their own, and they sell wherever they want and wherever they can. For example, the in here this case, Jalala, Chicahuaxla, their biggest sales and their main sales are the ones they make at the museum. So we have a shop and they offer their goods there. And again, it's not like we tell them you need to bring this in order to be sold. They can bring whatever they want, and it will be up to the public if it's accepted or not. And then they decide what to do with that. But the museum doesn't tell them what to do.
Great. Any other questions?
Can I just ask a really simple question?
Yeah.
What about the time span to weave one of these? Do you have some sort of idea, like maybe some took longer than others? And counting from the people that spun their own yarn, maybe leave that part out and then say something about it, but just not in the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not like they spun these yarns for these Huipiles. They already had some spun yarn laying around and they used it here. But for example, this was the longest. This was the most challenging one, the brown one. And it was so challenging that at the bottom of the central panel, you don't see the red stripes that go on the lateral sides because they ran out of time. That was not meant to be. it is it is special. I like it, the fact, but it was not meant to be. On the back, it is perfectly matching over the three lengths. So
Like perfectly matching, there isn't all the supplementary.
Like on the one at the top, the bottom border of the three lengths of fabric, they match on the one at the top. On the back of this, you have this section on the three panels. You don't have this empty space.
So why didn't they make that side? What's so different about that side because they're almost always somewhat reversible? I mean, turnaroundable.
Yeah, well, it is wider than the others, so that is a lot of more work. And then, let me see, yeah. So these are four selvages. Do you know the technique? These are four selvages. They start weaving here, and they move on up to here. Then they turn the loom around and they start weaving from the back. And they are coming from the back and they need to close here. So this was the last section to be woven. And the last section to be woven, because it is more open, needs to go on the front of the huipil. It is not a choice. It has to go on the front because it's part of what the huipil means, and that is, it is linked to the metamorphosis of butterflies. So that is the moment when it matched only on this tradition. Mm-hmm. So all of them took.
It has to be
In
about
this
all
case.
three panels for that cultural region.
Yeah, in this case. Yeah.
See, more information.
We have a question.
You could just talk all night, right?
Yes.
Hi, Hector. Sorry that I got here very late, so I don't know if you talked about this, but I would love to know. I mean, now that we're all concerned about climate and thinking also about like more sustainable materials, is there anything being done with these communities to explore other fibers other than cotton?
No, and no, it's not. But the ones that are using cotton, it is grown as probably was done at the very beginning of humankind. Every family has a little bit of cotton. It is not the whole plant field with the cotton plants. Each one of them has a little bit of cotton, and actually, for the one on the bottom right, Odilon would tell me that they used the cotton that they call the hummingbird cotton, because it is the hummingbirds that, when building their nests, carry those fibers around and those seeds around, and that's how it grows in San Pedro Musgos, for example. But no, we are not doing anything about that in particular, and I don't think anywhere in Mexico, and that is a very important conversation to be had for sure. At the same time, I wonder what would the substitute would be, because a lot of people talk about bamboo fiber, but it is also very pollutant because of the process that needs to happen to make the fiber out of bamboo. So it is a difficult question, and sustainability in itself is also difficult because, as we were saying before, they all live of the sales of this, and how many of these can you sell for 40 years, and what is the print of that? And if consumers are getting all this sense of, okay, I shouldn't buy as much clothing as I would like or as I can, well, then what's happening here? What is happening to these livelihoods if people are consuming less or buying less? So it is a very complicated issue that needs to be discussed. Yeah.
Any other
So
questions?
the cotton they spin is really grown on their own little
Yeah.
plots, right?
Yeah.
And how do they keep the colored cotton and the white cotton separate? Did you ever see how they do that? So they don't
I know
because they
are-
can mix,
Yeah,
you know?
I know they are planted in very
Yeah, but
separate
they have to be
places.
far away,
Yeah,
yeah.
I know
And
that.
do the hummingbirds pollinate or different birds pollinate? Or we don't
I
know.
don't know about that.
Maybe that you don't know. Somebody might take us.
Itai has another
Yeah,
question.
Hector, maybe another question, because I'm very intrigued by your own work. In a way, you were talking about the community of weavers, and I know the work that you do as a museum director, and I know other projects that you do. So, how do you thinking? We in New York have very specific idea of what a museum director does, but obviously your role is a little bit different, and I wonder how you as a how do you see yourself within this project? Do you see yourself as somebody who brings everybody together? Do you see somebody who directs and maybe push forward new ideas? Do you see the museum as a center for the community, or something more, let's say, New York like a museum as a place to come and experience or come to learn and study?
Well, first of all, I'm very lucky to be director at this museum because I got a lot of freedom to do many different things and get support by our patrons. But yeah, I really enjoy what happens when weavers are brought into the action, not only as spectators, but actually, or not only as researchers or consultants, but actually doing something, because that is the thing they enjoy the most, doing something. We For this certificate course we had 90 hours talking virtually about textiles. 90 hours. Then 30 hours in person, and everyone went crazy because that's when they could actually touch and feel and weave and exchange and do and make. So I really like that to happen. And I do see the museum as a place of to experience things, but I also think that we are very much aware of our audience. And we have been criticized by that because we are called Museo Textil de Oaxaca. So people expect to always see textiles from Oaxaca, and it's not always the case. Our collections are universal, and they are universal because we want people from Oaxaca to have a look at what happens everywhere else. So we had once a show on Central Asian textiles, and a couple that came from this city was really upset, saying that they traveled all the way there to see an exhibition on Oaxacan textiles. If they wanted to see Islamic textiles, they would go to the Met. And I was like, well, lucky you that are able to go to the Mets. This is the place of reference for people that live around Oaxaca, in and around Oaxaca. For that Japanese exhibition that Aaron mentioned, um, for the opening, there were weavers present, and one of them approached me at the end and said, "We are very lucky that the Textile Museum exists here. Otherwise, we would never have the opportunity to see these textiles up close." So that is very satisfactory to hear, and that I think complies with our mission and our main interest, that is to benefit the weaving communities of Oaxaca.
I was actually there last year when you had the Japanese
Ah.
textiles, and the one thing that is pretty magnificent about the museum is it does tell stories of different cultures through the weaving, through the textiles, etc. So, I mean, I could understand why you'd want to see changes throughout because it's quite magnificent for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that.
Thank you. I am curious whether you see yourself as a kind of weaving activist to keep the weaving alive and to support and um, there are many weaving activists, say in South Asia and who are really trying to figure out markets and figure out how to provide a living a livelihood for weavers. And I just wonder whether that kind of concept exists in Mexico and whether you see yourself as part of it at all.
Thank you. The concept exists in Mexico. I wouldn't call me that at all. I mean, the word activist is a very big word, and I don't think I fit into that. But going back to Itai's question on how I see myself there, is difficult to split the job and the person. And that's what happens here. And that's, I think, part of why all these experiments work in the end, because we are very close. It's a very small museum. We are 17 all in all, including the guy that receives people at the front desk and the guy that is in charge of communication. The communication team is one person, and he does everything. So we are a very small institution, and whenever weavers, embroiderers, dyers, spinners arrive into the museum, we all see them and we all have the opportunity to talk to them. And depending on their interest, they end up talking to the workshop coordinator, to the collections manager, to the conservator, to the accountant, and then we all know each other very well, and we receive invitations for their weddings, their baptisms, the opening of a workshop, and and that's how it flows. It flows very organically. We just need to throw out a seed and see what happens. But I don't. It might sound naive, but I don't have a real strategy. I don't have a formula for these projects to happen. The idea just sparks, and I see who the players at the moment are and try to bring everyone on board. It's up to them in the end if they participate or not.
With that, please join me in thanking Hector Manuel Meneses Lozano.
Thank you.